Closing out the lineup for today, we are joined by the ever-popular and energetic, even when dialing in from the UK, Dr. David Rubens, Executive Director of the Institute of Strategic Risk Management. Dr. Rubens is a leading authority on the strategic management of complex operations in crisis environments. He gained his Master's in Security and Risk Management from Leicester University in 2006 and was subsequently a visiting lecturer and dissertation supervisor on their Terrorism, Security and Policing Master's program, and a visiting lecturer on the Strategic Leadership Program at the UK Defence Academy. David gained his professional doctorate in Security and Risk Management from the University of Portsmouth in 2016, writing his thesis on non-hierarchical command and control frameworks for hyper-complex crisis environments. More recently, in partnership with Emirates, Dr. Rubens has trained more than 4,000 people in security risk management, crisis management, and large event management since the COVID-19 pandemic commenced. Today, Dr. Rubens is sharing with us COVID-19 crisis management, learning from the past and preparing for the future.
Joe, thank you for that introduction. Greetings to everyone from London, wherever in the world you are. It is, of course, a pleasure to be here and an honour to be here today. I imagine that wherever you are in the world seems a pretty strange place at the moment. It seems that whatever we thought we knew about strategic risk and crisis management prior to January of this year has been tested against the reality that the world has thrown us and has been found wanting. And speaking to you today from London, it seems that even COVID-19 and the challenges that has thrown at us in every aspect of our society is mutating and changing in ways that are challenging the process that we've been put in place over the last 6 months. Stage 2, the second wave of COVID-19, is coming upon us. And there was a frightening headline in the Times in London on the day that was announced, which says, "Humanity will survive this." Until now, it seems that we've almost been as though we're in a classic zombie movie. And a zombie movie usually lasts about 2 hours. And then you have the opening bit where the zombies take over. And after about 20 minutes, somebody comes into the fantastic control room and says, "Mr. President, we have it under control." And you're thinking, well, you're 20 minutes into a 2-hour video film. I'm not sure how that's going to work out for you. One of the responsibilities that we have as a strategic risk and crisis management community is we have to deal with reality as it is, not as we wish it would be. And it seems to me that if we look back with the perspective of hindsight over the last 6 months, and actually a bit longer than that, because of course the first warnings of coronavirus, as it was then named, came out of Wuhan in China in December 2019. But it seems to me that one of the underlying fundamental issues is that we have not grasped the reality either of what is happening, or much more important of what does that mean? What is the significance of what has been going on a global scale over the last 6, 7, 8, 9 months? One of the problems that we have here is that we have got used to using the word unprecedented. Unprecedented is one of the words of our generation. It's interesting, somebody did a very fancy algorithmic search, and they found that between 2001, which is basically after 9/11, the attacks in New York, and 2010 to 2011, the word that came up most in discussions and in articles was crisis. We were in a crisis state. Between 2011 and 2016, 17, the word was resilient. Resilient, resiliency, resilience. It was the word de nos jours. It was the word of our generation. But from 2017 onwards, the word has been unprecedented. And if we look at the crisis or the threat or the risk environment that we're operating in, we are seeing unprecedented events on a regular basis, whether it is adverse weather situations, storms, hurricanes, floods. If it's infrastructure failure, So we're seeing the failure of power, lighting, heating. If it is resource depletion, cities running out of water. If it is pollution, if it is, of course, in Australia, it is both fires and drought. I had the pleasure to be in Australia with Dr. Gabriel Schneider and his team last year for this conference in Australia, when Australia was going through the drought and the fires. We were in Sydney and saw the fires. We were affected by the fires up there. But one of the problems which we were discussing with Gabriel is that there was talking about water management in Australia. And the truth, of course, is Australia doesn't have water to manage. It is becoming a dry continent. And so therefore, one of the questions we have to ask is does the risk management capabilities and frameworks and methodologies and concepts and metaphors and language that we have developed over the previous generation, does that fit over what we are facing today? And the question that I and people like myself are discussing all over the world. I have the privilege of being the executive director of the Institute of Strategic Risk Management. We're actually working on a white paper, policy paper on this at the moment. But one of the things that we're discussing on a very real basis is, are the issues that we're facing today, are they evolutionary? And evolutionary is part of natural change. And the truth of the matter is we've always been through natural change, whether it's from agrarian to urban, from urban to technological, technological to digital. And each of those changes have had impact and disruption and have caused massive pain and dislocation to significant parts of the population. And so the question we could ask is it evolutionary? Or is it revolutionary? Is it actually a changing system? Is it that the building blocks that we have used to model and engage with risk management, do they need to be rethought? But the thing about revolutionary action is it still uses the same paradigm. It still uses the same building blocks. So, for example, communism and capitalism are different parts of the same system. They use the same building blocks, the same understanding. But the question we've been asking at the F.ISRM, which I think pretty well all of us have been thinking about in our heart of hearts, is it actually mutational? Are the risks, changes that we're seeing, the transformations we're seeing, are they mutational? Are we actually seeing a species jump? And if so, what does that mean in terms of our conceptualization and modeling of risk? I'd like to just bring up one quote here from Klaus Schwab, who is chairman of the World Economic Forum. And in the 2019 World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, so that was pre-COVID, Klaus Schwab, the WEF executive chairman, said or wrote, "Our world currently stands on the brink of a mass political, technological, and social shift which will transform our existence in ways we cannot yet possibly know." Which will transform our existence in ways we cannot yet possibly know. And it seems to me that that brings up a challenge, because how can we prepare for changes, existential changes, that we cannot yet possibly know? Donald Rumsfeld made the famous quote about known knowns, known unknowns, and unks, which are called unks, unknown unknowns. And of course, the unknown unknown is a significant challenge, isn't it? And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to take just a few minutes of this presentation, and then hopefully questions and answers afterwards, and look at some of the issues that we need to explore or to consider or to engage with if we are to create a capability that is able to stand up to the challenges, not just of COVID-19, but of the risk environment that we are all entering into over, let's say, a time period of the next 10 years, between 2020 to 2030. And of course, not only do we not know what the risks and threats, the unknown unknowns, will be in the coming 10 years, but the truth of the matter is that the technology and the capabilities that we will be using to solve our problems in 2025, 26, 27 do not yet exist. They will be something new that we can not only not know about, we cannot conceive of. And yet from today, at this point, right today, we have to start thinking about that and preparing for ourselves. So the first question is, what does the word unprecedented mean? And the word unprecedented should mean unique. It is something unique. If it's unprecedented, genuinely unprecedented, then it's something that we cannot build a model of, because there was no way of modeling that based on previous data. Risk management is very much a mathematical exercise at one level, because you take what you know about the past, you model it for the present, and you project into the future. You try and build a picture of future activity. But if something is unprecedented, then what it basically says is it is unique. And actually, if we're looking at crisis management, a crisis should always be unique, because we should not be having a crisis for the second time. And the reason I say that is because in my experience, a lot of times when people talk about crisis, certainly about crisis preparation and crisis management, they're making a fundamental technical mistake. And the fundamental technical mistake they're making is when they're talking about a crisis, that is what I call a major incident, because they have a crisis plan. And they think they can bring their capabilities and their methodologies and their systems and their processes in order to engage with that and deal with it, which is good. I'm not disparaging that. That is excellent. But that's not a crisis. That is a major incident, because it is a rational problem. It is a problem which you have had experience before. You have capabilities that the leaders should have understood, have had, through their career, have understood, built an experience, their personal experience based on that. They have an ability to put teams in place and to respond. They can model what's going to happen. They can have an understanding that if we do this, then that will happen. If we do A, the reaction will be B, and therefore we can move the situation in the direction we wish to do so. That is not a crisis. A crisis is transcendental. It is overwhelming. It goes beyond, it is existential. And in that sense, we cannot prepare for a crisis. I think we're learning that more and more. And so the first thing we have to do is we have to be honest with ourselves about what a crisis is. COVID-19 is neither a crisis, should not have been a crisis, but it is certainly not unprecedented. We have been having major global pandemic scares every 2 years for the last 20 years. We've had SARS in 2003, which I'll come back to. We've had MERS, we've had Zika, we've had Ebola, we've had H1N1, we've had avian flu, we've had swine flu, and then of course we've had global annual flu influenza pandemics, which have killed more people than COVID has even come closer to it. And so one of the things that we should have done as a global community, in my opinion, and I'm sure that many of you will agree, is we should have done what every risk manager should do. And what every risk manager should do is they should take absolute benefit of near misses. Near misses is God's gift to the risk manager. Because what near misses does, it allows you to practice your moves safely. And yet we have not. We have within the F.ISRM, the Institute of Strategic Risk Management, since the 20th of March, we have twice a week held global campfires, coronavirus campfires, with people from all over the world dialing in and just chatting about this. And that has been, we're now up to, by the time you watch this, we'll be close to 56 campfires, all of which have been recorded. So that is a real-time longitudinal study from across the world of COVID-19. And I think that the third point that was made on the 20th of March, on our very first coronavirus campfire, was, where is the global response? Where is since the end of the Second World War, for the last 70 years, 75 years, we've had global frameworks in place. The World Bank, the OECD, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, we've had the European Union, we've had the G20. And yet nowhere have we seen to a truly global threat, a global response. And so those frameworks, if those frameworks are not in place, then things do not magically happen. And what we have done is we have not learned from COVID-19. That is not exactly true. Some have learned from these previous events. And the organizations in the countries that have learned are those countries that went through SARS in 2003. When that is basically the small countries of Southeast Asia, or the countries of Southeast Asia, which is Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and South Korea, all of which went through SARS in 2003. And because they had been through SARS in 2003, they were able to recognize the signs of a potential bad thing happening very early on. They had a sensitivity. And once they did that, they realized the significance. They were able to bring their people together and discuss that in a rational way, and to develop a range of potential solutions, each of which had their own cascading consequences. Those aren't for free. Every solution is a political decision and has to be measured and balanced against the potential unwanted consequences. But they were able to do so in a rational way. And therefore, what they did was they did not solve COVID, but they downgraded it from a crisis to a major incident. Because their ability to model and understand and rationalize based on their experience meant that they were able to deal with it as a rational problem. And if you look at the countries that, from my experience, for example, in Western Europe, we did not do that. We did not do that. And therefore, one of the first things that you have that allows you to downgrade a crisis to a major incident, in fact, it is the fundamental issue in downgrading the crisis, is pattern, sense-making, pattern recognition. That within the chaos, you recognize patterns. And from a technical perspective, those of you with an academic background will know that I'm talking about Gary Klein's theory of recognition prime decision-making, which basically says that we recognize what is in front of us based on our previous personal experiences. So a firefighter moving towards a factory fire will not be thinking about what he or she learned in the textbook. We'll be comparing it to previous factory fires that they've dealt with in their past and comparing it and building a rich picture, what's called a rich picture. And the difference between the experienced practitioner and the non-experienced practitioner is the experienced practitioner can build a rich picture based on incomplete or unclear information. They can make sense of it. And the beauty of that recognition prime decision-making model of understanding and sense-making is that not only does it allow you to build a three-dimensional rich picture based on what you're responding to, but it allows you to develop a four-dimensional picture projecting into the future. And you can think, okay, this is where we are now. And when we're responding to that fire, this is what it's going to be like in 5 minutes. These are the challenges in 20 minutes. And in 2 hours, this is going to be the situation. And one of the things that we have not yet grasped, in my opinion, until maybe potentially just in the last few days, is the ability to understand what this means, what COVID means on a long-term basis. Most of the policies that I've seen have been, in the UK at least, I do not want to go against the government. You know, they have a very, very tough situation. But nevertheless, a lot of their policies have been announced on a Friday evening, implemented on a Monday morning, and changed on a Wednesday. And that is not how you build strategy. And unfortunately, it's not how you build trust, which is one of the situations. So in the last couple of minutes open to me, I'd just like to talk about one thing finally, and that is resilience. I'd like to bring up another quote written by the minister in charge of crisis management for the UK government at the time. And this is from the forward of the 2017, so that's a couple of years ago, UK National Risk Register, talking about crisis management. And what it says is this: resilience does not come easily, but the UK has long experience. Call it what you will, but whether through the fabled stiff upper lip, blitz spirit, or just a stubborn determination, our resilience can be seen at the forefront of our handling of emergencies. I find that statement terrifying. The fact that a government minister can make that, that is not resilience. That is what you do when resilience fails. Because you're now left on your own, without a plan, without a program, having to make it up. That is not resilience. As Dr. Gabriel Snyder has spent many years developing his concept of presilience. Resilience is about not just surviving, but adapting and thriving within an unstable, changing, dynamic environment. And just as a last couple of points, I'd like to make a couple of points about resilience, what is required. The first thing that has to be within a resilient organization is sensitivity to its environment. If it is not aware of what is happening around it, then it will only be responding and reacting very late in the development cycle of any new challenges that come up. And what we've seen is that the UK government, from my perspective, and I'm sure many other governments wherever you are in the world, have not had that sensitivity to the environment they're operating. The second thing is you have to be a learning organization. If you're not a learning organization, making the same mistakes, then you cannot be resilient. And the third thing, and the final point is, you have to have agility and rapidity. You cannot expect the external event to fit in with your program. We have to have the ability to understand, accept, model, adapt, and respond to external events. And if there's one thing that we have learned, it is that COVID-19 is not the big one. COVID-19 is yet another near miss that allows us to learn, to be aware of our failings, and then hopefully to prepare better. So that is my ideas on some of the issues around resilience and crisis management as we have learned from the lessons of COVID-19. I very much look forward to engaging now with this global audience and answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, David. And as always, thank you so much for joining us. We know that it was an early start for you in the UK, but I'm sure all of our guests and listeners will agree that between Professor Blackland and yourself, we have a really large-scale geopolitical view on some really big ideas. So I'm going to start running through some of the questions, and I don't believe we'll have time to answer all of them, but let's see how we go. Thanks. So first question for Dr. Rubens. Why do we keep failing at crisis response if we should know better by now? David, over to you to answer that.
That, of course, is a good question. General Stanley McChrystal, who's well known to many people here because of his work on leadership and his work in Afghanistan, special forces leader, etc., says very famously, a lot of people say it, Stan happens to say it very well, you can have all the strategy and tactics in the world, but you've got to get the culture right. If your culture is not right, nothing else counts. And just like in so many other things, if we look at academic work actually gives us an understanding and an insight and a framework to some of the approaches we can take. You look at high reliability organizations which have to deliver in environments of high level criticality. And the underlying fundamental value of a high reliability organization is acceptance of management of risk, acceptance of responsibility. You have to accept the responsibility. And if you don't accept the responsibility, nothing else counts. I mean, that's the way it goes. There is absolutely nothing in, as I said in my presentation, and as both yourself, Professor Blackland, have referred to, there is nothing that is unknown. You know, these are not unprecedented. These should not have been surprise events. These are absolutely central to our governmental risk management, risk registers. You know, this was their responsibility. And the problem we have, because as I mentioned, from my perspective, we often have the case that when people talk about crisis management preparation, they're actually talking about major incident preparation. A crisis, by definition, is overwhelming and unprecedented, and it knocks your systems out. If your plans work, it's not a crisis. I mean, that's the truth of the matter. And so we often have the case, just like John Brown, who was the head of, Michael Brown, who was head of Federal Emergency Management Agency in 2005, responsible for moving into Hurricane Katrina. And he very famously said, we were absolutely ready for this, but the unexpected level of rain prevented us from deploying. And you think, well, what did you think was going to happen in a hurricane flood situation? There's a famous story about, of course, Mike Tyson, who said, you know, everybody has a plan until I punch them in their head. And it seems that crisis management works perfectly until the exact moment a crisis happens. I'm sure that every government would have said, yes, we have a pandemic plan and we're ready until one happens. So I think it comes down absolutely to responsibility of acceptance. So the acceptance of responsibility. And to do that, you have capabilities and understanding. It's not magic. It's not voodoo. And the other thing is, very briefly, Gav, I'd like to take a few more questions, is we need to differentiate between crisis management and emergency response. Because what's failed is not crisis management, what's failed is emergency response. The ability to get our national health services in place, the ability to get PPE, personal protective equipment. Basically speaking, to go back to another military analogy, I think it was Bradley Omar, the American general, who's supposed to have said, amateurs talk about tactics and strategy, professionals talk about logistics. And in emergency management, it's almost always about, once you get into the emergency management phase, it's about deployment of resources. It's getting what you need, where you need it, when you need it, in sufficient quantities. That's not crisis management. That's just basic government organizational competency. And the fact that we have seen that fail so regularly is, I think, a indictment of the cutbacks and the lack of capabilities and the lack of expertise we've had. I'm not quite sure why we keep failing, because the reasons for failure are well understood. You know, communications, leadership, integration, transparency, trust, forward-looking sense-making, all of these things are not unknown. And I just hope that, again, we take lessons from what we've learned so far, and we learn for the future. But it's not magic and it's not voodoo. And if we don't change things, then the outcomes won't change either.
Thanks, David. On to the next question. What do you think the biggest emerging global threats are? I'm sure you could talk about that one for a long time, but hand over to you.
I could write you a 3-year program, master's level program. I think that there's so many that my answer would be it's not a single issue. Of course, global warming is always there, environmental change. But I think it's the issue of complexity. I think that is the issue, that we have these overriding and overlapping complex situations. I was at a major conference in Delhi, New Delhi, at the beginning of the year, and they had some serious people. They had ex-prime ministers from Canada, from Australia. They had Karzai from Afghanistan, and they said to them, "What is a big problem?" And they all said, "Well, we really need to start dealing with global warming." But my feeling is that if we say that, we don't need more policy. If we accept and we recognize that, what we need is methodology. We need methodology. As I'm sure Professor Blackton will tell you, the worst thing you can say to an academic is, interesting theory, I'm not sure where I see the impact. Because if you don't see the impact, then the answer is, what the hell and who cares? As Professor John Blackton said, the so what problem, the so what question. So I think that we've had enough. We know what the emerging threats are. We know what the risks are. The question is, can we do something about it? And the answer is yes, we can, if we have the political will. What we don't need is another conference or another policy or another white paper. We've had all of those for 30 years. What we need is people to begin to accept responsibility and to demonstrate a methodology that will lead us from where we are to where we wish to be. So again, there is unfortunately no magic, and often the solutions are relatively simple to understand. You know, it is purely about a will to implement change, which is difficult, and yet there is no other solution. That is what is required.
Thank you, David. Moving on to the next question. Well, we've only got about 4 minutes left and 3 big questions.
Okay,
so I may have one or two. But Spencer Wakelam has asked, do you not feel the global frameworks that you reference have been undermined by the leader of the free world? He's disparaged G20, G8, the WHO, the Paris Climate Accord, NATO, and traditional international alliances, all in the name of introspective American first populism. That's probably a politically centered question, which feel free to just give a 1 or 2 line answer, and we can move on to the next ones.
The answer is it's much more deep-rooted than that. It's much more deep-rooted than that. You know, John will talk about, I'm sure, historical tendencies. You know, you have historical tendencies which are, you know, which are over generations, and certainly over 10, 20, 30 years. I think we're in a, you know, we are in a historical period now. The question is whether the Trump era will be seen as a significant. I don't think it will be significant. I think the rise of China is much more significant, and the impact that's having on our Western frameworks. I think as you get to a certain age, you realise that these things are often blips. You know, we looked at 9/11, which we thought would be world changing. In some way, it has, but you know, life carries on. So, so my feeling about the impact of Trump is it's a blip, and you know, it will. There's something called reversion to mean. It will go back to what we consider as normality at some stage.
Thanks, David. I'm going to link these 2 questions together.
Yep.
What makes a risk a strategic risk? And then the next part of that, which I think we can link together, even though there were different people asking them, how do strategic risks affect the activities of protective security in a federal government context? And that would be an Australian federal government context.
Strategic risks are risks. Again, you know, how many beers do you want to drink while we discuss it? I mean, you know, and the more beers you drink, the deeper the conversation gets, in my experience. Strategic risk is risk which impacts the environment around you. You know, it's not something that affects you, but it impacts the environment you're operating in. And so, for example, global change or transport or communications or satellite infrastructure, that's strategic because that's the reality you're operating and you have to deal with it. So, for example, things like, you know, the drought in Australia or the forest fires, if it affects a neighborhood, then that's not a strategic risk. But if you have an environment where forest fires are the new norm at a scale and a scope which goes beyond anything you've modeled for or have resources for, and it impacts the way you run your country and your economy, then that's a strategic risk. So I think strategic risk impacts on the environment you're operating. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. And how you look at that PSG from a government framework, I think it is just like any other risk management. The first and fundamental issue about risk management is, do you get your risk register right? You know, is it on your risk register? And if it is, the first question is, what is it? And the second is, what does that mean? You know, we had pandemic planning, but we did not think, I'm sure that many organizations had business interruption policies, but nobody thought that, you know, international global travel would be shut down, you know, entertainment would be shut down, we'd be in furlough for 6 months, we'd have cities in lockdown. That wasn't on the risk register. So that wasn't under the impact. So we had something on the risk register, which was pandemic, but we didn't understand what it meant. So I think that from a government perspective, it is very, very much that ability to not to understand it, because if you understand it, you know, nobody could have predicted the way that I don't think anybody could have predicted, you know, global lockdown for 6 months. But to go back to those ideas of resilience, which is sort of sense making and sensitivity, integration, deference to expertise, rapidity, being a learning organization, all of those sorts of things. It brings resilience, and resilience, of course, which, you know, Gavin, you've spoken about so eloquently and in a structured way. And I think that's the word. If we are to deal with it, we need to move away from this intuitive understanding of, okay, there's a risk or resilience. But we need to have two things that will allow us to have impact and influence, and that is structure and methodology. And I think that is almost the responsibility of government agencies, is to model and understand the environment they're living in, or we're living in, and then to create a structure and a methodology that would allow us to deliver all of those things that we need to do so within a, as you say, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous future.
Thank you, David. And certainly between the three sessions we've had today, the focus has been much more strategic and macro in nature. I'd urge you and invite you to follow David and many of us as we work through the Institute of Strategic Risk Management and try and help combine some of these theories into actionable methodologies that would hopefully be effective for all of us. So Professor Blaxland, Dr. David Rubens, thank you so much for your time and input. We do have a few more questions, but we're out of time today. So from our side of the PSG, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And we hope this is once again just the start of a conversation, because so many big ideas have been put on the table. We'll hand back to Joe. Thank you.